India's number one priority. Frankly, the issue is not should India globalize or should India not globalize. Even if you're going Atmanirbhar, right? The preconditions of making Atmanirbhar Bharat are the same as the preconditions of having a chance to succeed globally, right? So that was in a sense one. The second part of that competitiveness story actually requires the state to do things. So think of what makes economies competitive, right? Productivity, technological innovation, but most importantly, you have to have sustainably low energy costs. You have to have relatively low transport costs, right? Logistics, energy, right? Infrastructure. And India made a significant progress on that, I think, in the mid 2000s, right? In fact, that's one of the reasons we did get, that 8% growth spurt, right? But it's still an open question whether if you actually add up a lot of these cost structures, energy, for example, right? Logistics, for example, whether we are as globally competitive as we should be, right? And then the final piece of the puzzle in this, there are lots of other puzzles, the final piece of the puzzle was the financial sector. Now, one of the oddities about India's globalization, as many economists, Arvind Subramanian, in fact, Jagdish Bhagwati had pointed out first, right, is that we prioritized finance over trade, right? And in part, we prioritized finance because our own domestic credit and banking system has consistently been broken for a very, very long time, right? And by broken, I don't just mean that you have the problem of non-performing assets, is credit available? Broken in a deeper sense, do you have a banking system that can actually finance innovation, venture capital, those kinds of things, right? Okay. And one of the consequences of privileging finance, many would argue, was that there's a tension between privileging finance and privileging an export-led, trade strategy, right? Partly it's reflected in your exchange rate. I'm not speaking of now, but the broad sweep in the 1990s and 2000s, right? So I would submit that while we did the liberalization relatively well, I think the commitment to globalization, the direction at least was clear. Our commitment to creating the preconditions of competitiveness, right? Those commitments remained very uneven at best. And I actually don't see a massive change in our paradigm. As I said, those conditions are still the same, whether or not you want to do Atmanirbhar Bharat or whether you want to do globalized Bharat. You're on mute, Dipanshu.
Yeah. Just to kind of, pick up a little bit on that. The idea of competitiveness often is seen a lot from the perspective of integrative possibilities of trade, investment, mobility. We did reasonably okay in Amen. And in fact, that is what allowed the Indian rupee to stay a little bit higher than valued.
Yeah.
And that was something which this led to this conflict between central banks and the government that we need to probably do or have a revised structure. But what about internal competitiveness that one could see from the perspective of states trying to get the better version of themselves? So somehow we didn't witness the same degree of focus on states like, for example, states like in the South and the Northeast, which did invest in areas of health, in a way because they were aware that they were Atmanirbhar, not by the allocation of funds from the center or the union government, but in fact that they had to prioritize, because if tomorrow they faced any issues with healthcare access, they had to invest in those logistics. So some of those states which did so, it seems that they are now perhaps in a much better position. And I think that's what the COVID crisis particularly has done, is it's exposed those vulnerabilities. So how does this idea of competition largely phase out when you start looking at it in a more inward lens rather than?
See, so I'll be a little bit controversial on this. I know it's been a mantra that, if you get the states to compete, you will somehow get better outcomes, right? And obviously, in a colloquial sense, it's true, right? I mean, some states want to look good, and it's a spur to states to do better. But frankly, there's no analytical basis for thinking that in the following ways, right? So one, I actually do think in the COVID crisis, for example, right? I think one of the big mistakes we made early on was get the states into a competitive dynamic, right? Where we were judging every state by its death rate statistic or the incidence of disease statistic, right? We know, given the nature of this disease, that was the wrong way of going about, where every state every week was trying to make sure that it was not in the top 3 and not in the top 5. Right? It set up completely perverse incentives. This is one nation, one pandemic in a state center sense. I mean, obviously there are other variations, right? Number two, I think it's a little bit premature. Obviously, Kerala did very well, and the kinds of institutional support, combination of decentralization, civil society, state commitment that kicked in, right, helped Kerala, at least has so far helped Kerala. Tamil Nadu did not do that well, right? Andhra did not do that well. So I do think we should be a little bit careful about, social scientists say under what conditions are what things strengths and what things weaknesses. Number two, in terms of the larger dynamic competitiveness of states, right? I think there's 2 or 3 things. One, the most important area where states should have been competitive and where they weren't, right, is in terms of mobilization of resources. Right? Remember, most of the development functions are still either in the concurrent list or the state list.
Yeah.
And as much as we complain about centralization, the fact of the matter is that for 6 decades, health and education were state subjects. Most state government budgets were relatively flat. I haven't seen a single state government committed to saying, except at the margins, we are going to make our state the next global higher education hub, right? Right? Now, the question to ask is why not, right? And part of the answer is that the one place where the states refused to exercise any kind of autonomy was in internal resource mobilization within the states, right? Take property taxes, for example, right? Right? Yeah. And if you are not raising your own resources, right, then the other competitive stuff is just epiphenomenal, right? I mean, if you all have pretty much the same budgets, right, right, year after year, then maybe getting a 5% or 10% improvement in delivery, right, doesn't, in a sense, give you the big gains. Number 3, I think, and this is really the most important part, I think, given the migrant crisis, we have to say, is one of the great achievements of India in the last 25, 30 years is that it became an integrated domestic market, right? I mean, the fact that 200, 300 million people move to work every year, right? It's an integrated labor market, right? Very importantly, an integrated labor market. Now, of course, it's an integrated tax system with the, within a sense, the GST. It's always been an integrated market in terms of the movement of natural resources. In fact, many of the states in Eastern India and Bihar and Jharkhand have historically been disadvantaged because they could not leverage their natural resources, because we insist on pricing, coal the same in Maharashtra as in Bihar, right? Now, if Bihar's competitive advantage goes away, right? I mean, no matter what you do, nobody's going to come and invest in Bihar. So the fact is, India is an integrated market. And the Achilles heel in one part of India, right? If you invest in human resources in UP, it actually affects the whole of the labor market in India, right? So, I mean, I actually think this competitive mantra, like both cooperative federalism and competitive federalism, they actually became slogans rather than resting on analytical structures that ask the question, okay, in which areas would competition actually help? And it turns out those areas are actually relatively marginal. I mean, they're marginal in the sense that given fixed resources, it's marginal in improvements in the efficiency of delivery here and there.
It's interesting because I just got reminded a little bit of reading when I first read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and his framework of the invisible hand. As you rightly point out, the idea of competition as a gravitating factor to allow for a better utilization of resources, which at least from the way at least the classical economics and then the neoclassical structures started coming in, because a lot of the way in which planning in India has happened somehow has been relying on that neoclassical / neoliberal structure, which is that allow for markets to come in, things will, I mean, greater competition is great. But the one of the points that was very integral to Smith and something that you echo here as well, is that what you require is a greater degree of co-opetition, which is you cooperate between variables at a macro level and allow those with similar set of skills to gravitate towards one cluster and then compete with others. It's not as if that you're in this style or constant process of competition between, let's say, the states or institutions that is counterproductive to that very cycle.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, you're taking me back many years to my PhD dissertation on Smith. Look, I think two things, right? I mean, one, the simple question we have to ask is, what is the nature of the good you're trying to produce? Do you seriously want a race to the bottom competition in the production of environmental goods in India?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it just cannot happen, right? I mean, we've seen it trying to solve our bad air problem in Sonipat in Delhi, right?
Yeah.
Right? So I think one of the things, and one of the big lessons of the last, I think, 10, 15 years is that instead of thinking of a development paradigm that operates between, okay, states failed, let's go to markets. Public goods failed, let's go to private goods.
Yeah.
Right? Centralization failed, let's go to decentralization. And then we oscillate back, right? Yeah. The simple question to ask is, what is the objective you're trying to achieve? And what are the conditions under which the thing that you're trying to achieve is actually going to, in some senses, come about? I mean, that old joke that there's only one social science question, which is under what conditions?
Under what conditions? Huh.
And once you ask that question, then these things become a little bit more differentiated, that you're not going to produce environmental goods the same way you might actually produce, private investment. You will need a national policy on, for example, the use of natural resources, right? I mean, what would competitive standards mean in the exploitation of natural resources? That some states would decimate the environment more, would have no labor standards at all. Labor standards also have to be somewhat coordinated, right? Otherwise it's a race to the bottom. So I think I think we need to get away from these broad brush paradigms, state versus market, and ask much more fine-grained questions of the kind that your center is actually doing.
So one of the other things, and let me just kind of take this out of the more macro scenario, because one of the things that I keep telling this to Professor Roy as well, is that we just have too many macroeconomists in the policy thinking landscape. And one of the things that it does is it leaves a lot of distributive questions out in the scheme of things and how that is happening. So let me just go into this point around the distribution of wealth and the creation of wealth. How has that happened over the last 2 to 3 decades? And it reminds me of this column that you'd written in 2019, when there was this lot of discussion around minimum cash transfers, and I think the Nyaya scheme, which had come and put in by the Indian National Congress. And I mean, that was a part of a larger discussion which was happening on universal basic income for, I don't know, since, I mean, it's been out there in the 1970s, with Milton Friedman's negative income tax and so ever. But one thing that you talked about was this, reflection on the structure of, you say that the bad faith of our discussions on poverty is really reflected more strongly in the bad faith of discussions we have over taxation.
Yeah.
And the burden of the social contract, as always, has to fall on the poor. So the question I would probably want to ask you is, what factors in your understanding have contributed towards this, deep asymmetry of power within the social landscape that we're seeing? And this has been exacerbated under the current circumstances.
That's a very big question. I think, 3 or 4 things, right? I mean, one, and by the way, India is not an outlier on this. I mean,
Yeah,
there are
of
varying
course.
degrees of the same phenomenon. I think one of the big puzzles, or maybe it's not a puzzle in democracy and democratic theory, right, is that, till the early 20th century, everybody used to think that if you give universal suffrage and democratize, the first thing that will happen is that the rich will get expropriated and be thrown out. And it happens nowhere in a democracy. Not only does it not happen, actually democracies have shown themselves to be compatible with quite extraordinary levels of economic, inequality, right? Now, I think you need sort of 3 different kinds of responses on this, and I'll just name them. I mean, each of them would require a seminar in their own.
Yeah.
So one is, of course, the functioning of the political process itself, right? Which is, to what extent is power channelized in a political process in a way in which it becomes harder for coalitions of the poor to actually come together and exercise power in a way in which plutocrats can much more easily exercise. And this stuff requires thinking across a whole range of variables, election finance, the nature and funding of political parties. And again, as I said, India is not an outlier on this. I mean, I think the United States does at least as bad, if not worse, a job, on this, which is our political processes are simply not, in a sense, representative in that way, right? That's one piece of the puzzle, right? I think the second piece of the puzzle is and this is genuinely a question I have. In a paper I wrote with Michael Walton a few years ago, we toyed with this idea that, elites, let's face it, elites in a society matter a lot, right? They have disproportionate power. So I'm not saying it's a good thing whether they matter or not, but the fact is they matter a lot, right? And one of the puzzles we had, looking at different models of development, let's say even comparing China and India's approach to globalization, to take a less controversial topic than kind of redistribution downwards, is elites often operate with particular cognitive maps, right? Views of the world. Now, sometimes these views of the world can be entirely self-serving. They hold these views because they serve their interest. I mean, being a little bit reductionist about it. But sometimes, in some ways, right, these views are also created over the long run by a large process of academic and other kind of enculturation, right? What's an example? Just to give a very example, I mean, and since you brought up Adam Smith, let me use him an example. Till the 18th century, as you know, till the middle of the 18th century, most economists writing used to argue that rising wages for the poor is bad for the economy, right? I mean, that was an article of faith. Not only was that an article of faith, it was, not only does rising wages kill competitiveness, but if wages rise, people will actually stop working. I mean, they're just, right? Adam Smith's brilliance was to come and say, actually, rising wages for the poor is a sign of a good economy, right? Now, fast forward to the 2000s when Narega was introduced in India, right? You will recall, right, a lot of the criticism of Narega. So there's some criticism around implementation and stuff, which is fair enough. We can talk about that. But a lot of the criticism of Narega was, this is going to lead to a rise in rural wages, or it is going to lead to a rise in the bargaining power of rural labor, right? Okay. Now, it's true that under certain conditions, if wages rise much faster than productivity, you can set yourself up for a great fall later. Right? But this idea that was being, peddled in mainstream economics, right? That increasing the bargaining power of rural labor ever so slightly. I mean, we're not talking, disruptive power. We're just talking power at the margins, right? Is somehow going to be a catastrophe for the economy, right? This had become default cognitive common sense, right? So similarly with labor laws, right? The discussion right now, right, where in some sections there's a kind of almost a cognitive knee-jerk saying any labor law is by definition going to lead to a less productive economy, right? Now, implicit in that claim is lots of assumptions about the costs and benefits of particular laws, how they actually function. So I actually do think that the cognitive biases in some senses, and I use using the word cognitive biases because often these arguments are made in good faith. I mean, I'm not saying that people are necessarily being disingenuous. It's a series of assumptions we have become, in a sense, encultured, to, right? I think in the basic income debate, we can argue about the economic feasibility, but the argument that I find the least persuasive is the fact that if people had income support, they'd become lazy, right? I mean, you don't even know where to begin with that kind of argument, right? I mean, if that's an argument, then high incomes for the higher level groups, right, should also be good, right? So I actually think there is this sort of asymmetry even in our kind of cognitive, as it were, discourse. The third thing and the final thing, I think, which I just say, which comes back to politics, is, and this is a point many people have made, is, see, one of the challenges India faced over the last 15, 20 years, and one of the things that produced a particular kind of legitimacy crisis in Indian politics, was that plutocracy, right? Both in the wider sense of corruption, but the idea that small, powerful groups could inordinately influence politics, right? Right? Plutocracy became very deeply established, and that was part of the reason why the Congress system lost so much legitimacy. Right? 6 years ago, the big electoral issue was, in a sense, plutocracy. Right? The big question, right, is, in a sense, one of the advantages plutocracy has is because they're small in number and because the kinds of issues they can use to benefit them they don't require collective action, right? A little sneak in a tariff here, in the law here. Whereas creating delivery systems for the poor, right, actually requires the state to do things. And we kept on saying the one thing we are not going to do is increase the size of the state, right? That kind of argument simply played into the hands of the plutocrats, right? That the idea that the state must be limited, right, essentially reinforced all existing power asymmetries.
So in that case, the limited version of the state, do you think gave a greater sense of agency, control, or stakeholdership to the judiciary for that matter? Because a lot of these questions then started coming to the point. We have a couple of pointers because I see that the questions are coming in. But this idea of because now we are seeing now a bigger and much more deeply entrenched state presence in the way delivery, because I was observing, for example, in the villages when this distribution of food grains was happening, to be very honest, at least in Haryana and closer villages to 7-8 villages closer to the campus here, there were two things. One, yes, ration delivery was effective. That was happening. The second thing was farmers, in fact, at the time when they were stuck in the lockdown, were constantly saying that we need some form of local support by the state to help us transport our goods to Azadpur Mandi for the sale of fruits and vegetables. and to which the authorities at the local level were, well, we have instructions to get you dal and rice. And there is no way in which we can, even though if it is feasible to do so, we can do it. So sometimes what happens in such circumstances, whatever options you have is, well, you go to the, I don't know, the Supreme Court, or you go to file a public interest litigation, give you a set of things, and the court used to pull up the state and say, well, why are you not doing your job? So do you think that somewhere that became a kind of a, you know, existential structure which became embedded as the way of functioning for the state?
So two things, right? One, look, I think this question of the capacity of the state, I think that also needs a more nuanced answer. I mean, I think one of the ideological mystifications that happened in the last 10 years was, and you know, all of us do also say it in particular context, right? Rightly so, that look, the Indian state has no capacity. And it became a vicious argument, because if the Indian state has no capacity, there's no point investing in a state that has no capacity. Why do you want to pour water into a leaky bucket? And we were, in a sense, kind of caught in that, right? Now, here's the honest truth about it. The Indian state does have a lot of capacity. It's true that given the range of problems in India, governance will remain a scarce resource for a very long time, right? I mean, a state has to operate on 25 different fronts together, right? But it does not follow from that fact that in particular areas, when the state sets its mind to something, right, it does have the capacity to pull out, right? And it's done that in all kinds of sort of extraordinary areas. Actually, India even built in the 2000s, despite corruption and everything, extraordinary infrastructure, right? So I think the important thing is to use the state capacity argument as an argument to enforce greater accountability. It should not be used as an argument to prevent us from investing more in the state. Right? That, I think, was the conflation that happened a lot, right? So what typically happens right now is that, you know, as you know, if you look at the raw numbers, the Indian state in terms of number of personnel hasn't expanded much since 1991, right? But so what happens is that because governance is a finite capacity, finite resource, it will be reallocated depending on the circumstances. I mean, we used to have this joke that I think in the last 10, 15 years, every government in India does about 2.5 schemes very well. Right? The question is which 2.5 they decide to do. Some will do NREGA, some will do PMGSY, right? Right? So I think that's I think in a sense one argument about it. The second example you gave, which was a kind of interesting one about this local coordination story, and in fact, frankly, it was a larger argument. Remember, Punjab wanted gunny bags from Bengal. Yeah. The harvest is ready, but you know, how do we pack this stuff? Yeah. Now, one of the issues there, and this is a discussion that has more or less stopped in the country, right? I think one of the little strides of progress we had made in the 2000s was a discussion around devolution, 73rd Amendment, 74th Amendment, Panchayati Raj, urban governance, but also, frankly, a very underused institution, namely the Indian Interstate Council. Right? And a country with the diversity of India, what we actually need is less sort of rules, as it were. You obviously need rules and things to create predictability. But you need easy cultures of consultation and negotiation, right? I mean, the Punjab Chief Minister should be able to get on the phone with the Chief Minister of West Bengal, with the Home Secretary, and sort this matter out in 30 seconds, right? Right? Look, if you're creating exemptions for, you know, just realize this is a critical resource we need, right? So I think the question of the relationship between different tiers of government is less about formal powers and allocations, which is one aspect. But it is also about whether you have the cultures of negotiation, right? Where one part of government can say, look, we have been given an order that we are allowed to sell agriculture produce in order. The transport ministry is not letting us transport the stuff. who are the two people who can get on the phone in 30 seconds and talk to each other, right? Um, and a lot of good governance is like that. I mean, it's actually in these cultures of negotiation that you set up. The point you made about the courts. So, I mean, this is stuff I have written something on over the years, and I was never a big fan of the Supreme Court, in the sense that I actually do think, I mean, frankly, I think the domination of legal thinking in social policy has actually been far more destructive of social policy. So as you know, I mean, as the work of many scholars have shown, post-emergency, you had two things. One, you had the fragmentation of power in Indian politics. You had a succession of coalition governments, right? And second, you had, in a sense, the PIL revolution and the social and economic rights revolution, right? Now, let's be very clear. Insofar as the courts were independent, and even when they were independent, they were very careful to never frontally take on politics. Otherwise, the Indian system would have been cleaned up a long time ago, right? That independence was entirely an artifact of a very contingent feature of Indian politics, namely the fragmentation of power. It gives the court a little bit of room to maneuver. Second, the Indian courts have been much more grandiloquent in pronouncing rights. They cannot, by their very nature, right, pronounce remedies, right? I mean, as you know, famously in Olga Tellis, right, you have the right to shelter. What is the remedy? I mean, the remedy is, just a little administrative redress, right? The right to education is pronounced the day after India reaches 100% enrollment, right? I actually very, very strongly believe that, I mean, I know it's not a clear-cut line, there are gray areas, but the judicial entry into policy making decimated both policy making and decimated the legitimacy of the court.
Absolutely agree.
Right? And you're now in a situation, frankly, where the court is not doing the one function it is supposed to do constitutionally, which is actually protect basic civil and political rights. Right? I mean, I'll be very honest with you. I cannot, with a straight face, teach Indian constitutional law now. How can we have constitutional law when you don't have habeas corpus hearings? I mean, that's the cornerstone of any liberal constitutionalism. When you give up habeas corpus, everything else is gone. You might as well back up and go home, right? Right? No administrative law ruling of the Indian court makes sense. I mean, I envy law schools these days. I have no idea if somebody today asks me, what is the Indian law on X? Right? Other than saying two ingenious senior counsel who a particular judge might take fancy to, might decide what that law is tomorrow. I have no idea what that law is.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's interesting. Actually, that takes us to, because we have just around 5 to 6 minutes for me to at least finish this last final segment of the part that we had kind of decided. And this is actually a perfect juncture to move in, because if you go back to the pre-March scenario, and this is during the time of the Delhi riots around 2020, and the reason I bring out the courts, and the point that you make is, it's an open discussion I keep having with my law school colleagues, that if you don't do what you're required to do, and you're engaged in largely doing things in ensuring that you're having a larger space in areas of policy making, in ensuring agencies are functioning fine, what it does is there is less attention then to questioning what happens to the principal functions of the court, not only the Supreme Court, but the trial courts as well, in matters of criminal jurisprudence or criminal proceedings. I mean, the kind of stories I keep hearing from those who are practicing right now at this juncture, particularly from UP and Allahabad High Court, is baffling. But that is a time for another discussion. But let me kind of come back to what you wrote around the Delhi riots as a scholar. This is actually at the period of time when the riots were happening. And I do want to bring our attention to this. Then we go into the questions that you have. So you wrote this, and I quote, India is descending into a night of dread and despair. The ongoing riots in Delhi are not a tactical aberration, some absent-minded lapse of attention. They have been in the making for a while, and represent the future that our ruling classes, with our aid and support, have imagined for us. The idea is to carpet bomb the Indian Republic as we know it and replace it with a regime that thrives on cruelty, fear, division, and violence. Even as the politics of revenge starts, it is important not to forget the dynamics that led up to this moment. It is the first time in independent India that minorities cannot turn to any electoral formation or force to provide even basic protection. This is the depth of corrosion of normal politics. Such a deep political vacuum is found to be filled by forces we cannot predict. I want you, sir, to look at a little bit at this question. The fact that you say this at a time when the riots were happening and what we started seeing after that. In fact, even during the pandemic, the arrests of the women social activists and what is happening. How do you see this? I mean, how do we make sense of this?
No, so, I mean, this is the hardest subject to talk about, and I'm not sure we fully kind of understand it. I mean, so obviously, look, this question has a long history since at least since 1857, if not before, right? And it's come up in different iterations under different political formations. And certainly, one should not, project the 1980s or 1990s as a kind of golden age or something.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
In fact, I think the Congress's destruction of Indian secularism under Rajiv Gandhi is, prior to that, the Sikh. I mean, we are still actually paying the price for that in some senses. That's actually created that political space, right, for all of this to happen. So yes, there is a long and complicated history. But as I said in the column, I think there are three things very distinctive about that moment, even if you look at it against the yardstick of that history, right? So yes, there were the 1980s and, before that, the Ahmedabad riot in the 1960s and 2000s. The three things that are very distinctive is one, one of the virtues of Indian democracy was that at least there was a certain kind of fragmentation of power, which incentivized at least some political party. Those political parties didn't have to be, abide by a principle. In fact, there used to be a joke in UP politics that there are some parties that are, ideologically communal but electorally secular. Some parties that are electorally, communal and ideologically secular. Right. So this is a very complicated. But you always had the sense that there was some structure or formation that could step in as a little bit of a counterballast in case communalism went sort of out of hand. Not just a political party, even factions within political parties. Look, thoda zyada ho gaya, I know it's not a very reassuring, but there was some political counterweight, right? I think to most of us, it's not the level of violence, but what's, I think, worrying about this moment is that political counterweight has more or less disappeared. Even the Congress party cannot, or one should be surprised, but the Congress party cannot take a stand. I think the way the Delhi AAP has conducted itself in Delhi, for example, right, particularly in relation to riots, relief, all of that, it has more or less ceded that ground, right, in a sense to the BJP. I mean, the only difference is, look, we don't want violence, but otherwise all the issues, you can take away all the ideological grounds and all the ideological issues. Right? So that, I think, is structurally a very worrying thing. As I said, this is not about morals. I think this is just about the fragmentation of power and so forth. Right? Second, I think the degree of civil society penetration of communalism is, I think, unprecedented compared to anything in the last 20, 30 years, even the Babri Masjid time. I mean, during the Babri Masjid days, you could predict who was where. There were particular political formations. But I think a kind of anti-minorityism is now becoming the default common sense of India. And it can be the fact that it can be said so casually. I mean, I'll be very honest with you, it's very hard to have, conversations with friends and family in Delhi these days, because of those, and some of it has been exacerbated by, we can talk about this later, what social media does to the nature and character of this, right? And the reason this is important is that even if, let's say, by some miracle, right, there were to be an electoral reversal tomorrow, right? The one thing we know is that these structures of right-wing penetration of civil society, consciousness, organizations, that doesn't disappear easily into the world, right? So I think the turning back of this is going to be a very long haul. It's not just going to be a question of, look, let's defeat the, particular party, and it requires much more work in the space of, in a sense, culture and the third thing that I think is which you had shades of in the emergency, is that you have the alignment of communalism and authoritarianism, right? So what the alignment does is that even the basic minimal institutional protections you had, things like courts, and some high courts have been passing good orders as they did during the emergency, you can't even rely on those to act as a kind of sort of insurance policy, right? And now we've reached a stage, then there's this pandemic, now of course the China issue, where there won't even be, in a sense, political space to articulate and mount opposition to this. I mean, the CA movement is kind of dead in some ways. I mean, it's been sidelined. So this conjuncture is, I think, pretty unique and pretty dangerous for a democracy.
So we'll move now to the set of questions that were coming in. So let me start probably by this question, and we'll try keeping it in the structure of our conversation, because there were a couple of points that I thought I'll come back to later. I mean, Sunita Tripathi is a professor in the law school. She asks, in Burden of Democracy, you give clues about the harm of government indecision, inaction, and corrupt approaches. Leaving the competitive posturing at the international level aside, can we conceive a post-pandemic approach that restructures the functioning of institutions across the value chain with the aim of responsive and long-term stability, especially in sectors such as health? Disbursements of funds are useful to the extent of measuring report card performance in post-pandemic. Continuing a business as usual manner would seemingly lead us nowhere. How, in your view, will health innovation and distribution be reformed? So mainly the question around that.
Okay, well, this is a big question. So I think two things, right? One, in the early days of the lockdown, I kind of wrote a longish piece, and the argument or the sentiment was that, look, the pandemic should concentrate our mind, right? I mean, one of the things it has done is given us time for reflection. Let's get back to first principles and basics, right? And frankly, as I said, India is in an unprecedented position where you have a geostrategic crisis, a very, very serious one, not underestimated. You do have an economic crisis, how serious economists can debate, but certainly, given where India should be, it's going to be a long haul to get us out of this. And then, of course, you have a continuing health crisis in some ways, right? Health and economic deprivation. Now, this could be a moment, we often joke that, look, never let a crisis go waste, reform. But I'm always reminded of, there's a joke Dr. Abid Hussain used to tell us, not a joke, actually, it's an actual incident. Dr. Abid Hussain was a civil servant, one of the early liberalizers in the 1990s. And the story is that he once took a senior international economic official to meet a minister. And this official was making a case, sir, this is a golden opportunity for India. You have no option but to reform or perish, right? So, now concentrate your mind and reform. So when they came out of the meeting, this official asked Dr. Abid Hussain, so how did that go? So Dr. Abid Hussain says, he said, everything you said was fine, except that you shouldn't have said reform or perish. He said, why? He said, well, the minister might think that's a genuine choice, right? So, and look, historically it is true. Countries can shoot themselves in the foot, right? My own sense, to be honest, I mean, I know it's a cynical thing to say, but I think the China thing is going to be a little bit more of a wake-up call with the economic crisis, the COVID crisis first.
Yeah.
I mean, those are things, look, 2 to 300 million migrant labor bore the brunt of the lockdown. And frankly, that issue has already become passé. I mean, one of the puzzling things is, how does that anger now politically manifest itself, right? But the one thing that the China crisis does, because as I said, going back to the fact that elites matter, right, disproportionately, right? Push comes to shove, we can always use coercion to keep the poor down, right? Is that this pandemic or this crisis should in a sense concentrate our mind. Now, can we do it? As raw capacity, yes. I mean, there's no reason this is not rocket science. I think the big challenge is the country is so politically divided, and at some level, the distrust of government is so high.
Yeah.
Largely because of the communal and authoritarian issues, that it will actually raise the costs of us coming together and doing the kind of collective action required for this, right? But if the government, I'm not holding out great hopes, it's a big if, and look, for good or for ill, we still have this government for another 4 years, right? If the government were to say, look, in good faith, let us reset, right? Go back to first principles. Let's just adopt one basic rule. No person is going to be targeted for being who they are, right? Basic non-discrimination principle of a democracy. You can actually get a lot of energy flowing, right? But will this government, I mean, in that sense, it does share something with, in a sense, the Chinese government, which is, do we use this crisis to finish off whatever existing ideological agendas do we have, or do we use it to reset? That's an open question.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Bini, Rajneesh, I mean, he asked this question, and I think this is timely because the parallel with China that you've drawn, I think it's interesting because China around the early 80s was able to start experimenting with its, public-private sector arrangement in order to develop what you would consider as, dual track market reforms. And there's a lot that has been written in the political economy literature, but it's interesting, this question, I'm interested in Professor Mehta's views on the sale of public sector enterprises that have so far been sold, starting from Bharat Aluminium, Hindustan Zinc, VSNL, etc. in the early days, to the creeping sort of privatization that is taking place now by placing small tranches of shares for private placement. Does Professor Mehta think that private companies are more efficient? And it's a big question of efficiency. And does he think that public goods in India should be provided by companies whose boards only work to maximize the value or return for the shareholders? I mean, this is a classic question. It reminds me of the Milton Friedman versus kind of Jean Tirole kind of argument on what aspect of corporate social responsibility should an increased force of privatization move towards?
No, so look, let me complicate the question a bit, right? So one part of the question is, and I mean, I'm no expert in this, so one can just lay out the kind of general principle of which particular company it applies to. That obviously requires, looking at that company's record, balance sheets, where it is located, and so forth. Look, certainly for a long time, there has been a case for privatizing certain kinds of public sector enterprises, right? And you apply the usual metrics, right? Is the enterprise providing a public good or not? What is the likelihood that it can be bought at a value where it actually, the returns on that investment, right? Because remember, I mean, if a public sector capital, the public sector is giving you, 3% returns a year, and if it goes to private sector, you're getting 10% return a year on that. That's an opportunity cost also lost, right? And there used to be a joke. I mean, I think most of this audience is probably too young to remember, but in the 1990s, you used to do this calculations that if you actually took the money of the public sector enterprises and just put it in a low interest deposit, you would still get a higher rate of return, right? And that is an opportunity cost, by the way, right? Resources are scarce. So there one needs to have a very rigorous view of which particular assets it makes sense to hold on to and which right? And look at it in totality, because one of the other things about holding on to particular kinds of public sector enterprises is that it's a governance opportunity cost for the state as well, right? We just have so many other things to worry about. Factor markets, I think, is more complicated. I think that's the illusion in your example, right? Aluminum mining, coal mining. Again, typically it's the case that, as we are discovering, that countries that are relatively bad at their public sector doing this properly are also relatively bad at the private sector doing this properly. So if you are actually going to privatize it, is one of the preconditions of privatization being met, which is that, do you have a regulatory system that can enforce the kinds of norms you would need to enforce on a private player to make sure it did not do wanton destruction, right? Do you have a political economy? Very importantly, right? As we've seen in the power sector, as we've seen in all factor markets. One of the biggest things about factor markets, right, is the issue is not so much just public and private. You can make both work, and sometimes the private can work better. The issue is that the dominance of big private players in the private market can actually set up a very different kind of political economy of regulation, right? So for example, if you have 3 or 4 big players, let's say in the coal sector, who are private, right? Does that create then a political economy where you will actually continue to encourage coal in a way that maybe you don't want? Not because there's an economic logic, but just because there's a political economy logic to it, right? I think many companies, and this is not true just in India. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about, let's say, the Adani Group is that it's central to both the political economy of India and the political economy of Australia, right? In terms of mining. So I think that is something one needs a kind of much more sort of, nuanced answer to, in terms of which particular enterprises go public and which, which shouldn't. But here's a different question, right? Which is on the private sector. Because one of the things that we are actually learning, I think even from the US and China, actually, frankly, is, the public versus private dichotomy is again a very simplistic one. Because in the private sector also, you have varieties of ownership structures, right? So one of the arguments, for example, in the US is happening is the rise of shareholder capitalism actually good for innovation or not, right? So you can have private ownership, but does private ownership mean that shareholder capitalism is necessarily the most optimal, right? Right? Or you had the Chinese structure, right, which had public ownership, but within the public framework allowed competition, right? And then pick the winners and let the others die, right? So I think one of the challenges, and this is particularly true of the Indian private sector, right? Because this is an argument that many people have made, that if you look at the Indian private sector, at one level in certain areas, it has shown great innovation, right? But the preference curve of a lot of promoters has not been to, in a sense, innovate and create global products. The preference curve has to be to become a certain size, and then, in a sense, be bought over, right? In some ways. Now, that again may be a good thing, may not be a good thing, but we also have to look at the internal incentives within the structure of private ownership.
Yeah.
Right? For example, this debate over minority shareholders is a very consequential debate, because it's fundamentally about ownership. Who is taking the allocative decisions that ensure that the company is aiming at the long run, not aiming at simply raising its share price now, and then the promoters exiting and the company be damned, right?
All right. I mean, see, because you've touched upon factor markets, I have to bring in this, because there are 2-3 questions which are related. And I think this is in context to what's happening with labor reforms and worker workers generally. Of course, one of the things is that with the recent worker crisis, because I'm still kind of careful in using migrant worker as a term, because most of us are migrants as well, and I think that also reflects a little bit of the kind of the segregation of treatment in our labeling process. But what is it done is that I heard for the first time the finance minister mentioning the word street vendors in any public statement. It's basically that they were the invisibles for in any policy structure in the way government was revising or readdressing. So what has happened, and this is related to the two questions Advaita and Ashish asked, is made some states to kind of readjust and rejig a little bit of their labor laws. So the ordinance regarding labor laws in UP has been set for 3 years. To what extent does this actually affect the status and conditions for workers and what you'd call as blue collar workers? Do the laws actually have a tangible effect in their life? So basically, in other words, how are they, this question of bargaining power. In fact, I read one of your pieces, which was on that the agency in bargaining power for workers has not been there for in the existing structure as well. So yes, you need a reorientation, but a few of us, we've been arguing, well, you need more representation coming in from workers to be able to ensure that that change happens, but that wasn't. And the second related question to this is that you have, you boost economy and growth of secondary sector, the human rights of laborers are often compromised. A classic case in point being that for special economic zones to attract FDI. What is your view on what can the state do to create a win-win situation between workers and those who are pushing to attract investment? In other words, basically a question that Suresh Naidu also, like in the US, asks this is, how do you balance this scale of agency between workers and corporates?
So the Indian context is slightly different, I think, in the sense that, and this is one of the big challenges, right, for workers' rights, which is that where you have, let's put it this way, labor surplus in some ways, right? Obviously, the bargaining power is greatly disadvantageous to labor, right? And I think, again, this group is probably too young to remember. But to be a little bit fair, I think a lot of people have those images of the kind of late 60s and early 70s, right? Where, in a sense, it wasn't just about bargaining power. I mean, again, from the people were coming from the other side. Where did the bargaining power end up in a position that you practically disrupted any reform, right? In terms of, and remember, the formal sector in India is very, very small, right? So part of the challenge with labor reform has always been that this sector has protected its exclusivity at the risk of kind of expanding it out. Right? So I think the way I think about it is three different ways. One, given the informality story in India, right, and given, in a sense, the political difficulties of creating collective action in informal economies, beyond a point, you can do it, right? And given the, I think the first step in creating bargaining power is actually in India welfare protection, right? So in the US, right, when we talk of bargaining power, you often think of, okay, labor unions have declined. It's true. I mean, that's one element of, that's at a kind of firm level, that's at an industry level, right? But the bargaining power that comes from welfare protection, right? It should not only be welfare protection, to my mind, has three functions. It's not just a amelioration of distress or deprivation, right? That's the first function in which we use it, right? Somebody doesn't have food, give them food. You don't have income, give them a little bit of income. Its two more important functions are that, one, it actually critically gives you bargaining power, right? If I know that I'm not going to starve if I walk out of a job, right? there are certain kinds of small indignities I might be able to actually resist even at the firm level. Right?
Mm.
Which is why I actually do think the Rega was a form of bargaining power. I mean, we don't normally think of that as, connected to labor power, but actually it is, right? In some ways. Right? So, and I think in India, given the levels that we are talking about, right, which is, as this crisis showed, you have 40 to 50% of the households in this economy could not survive if they did not have a week's wages, right? Just in terms of income, at least that CMI survey that they did quickly, right? They asked one simple question, right? Suppose your income were to stop tomorrow, how much savings do you have that you could survive? And there was no other assistance, right? The answer is roughly about a week to 10 days. That's 50 to 60% of households. Right? Yeah. Now, the fact that they are always on the brink of necessity itself is the biggest reduction in their bargaining power, right? If I had a good public school to send my children to, right? If I had some basic healthcare access, and I had, good PDS, ration, some income support, that itself increases my bargaining power, right? So this idea that welfare is actually in that sense very important for dignity. It's not just about a handout. The third thing I think about the bargaining power story is, and this is where frankly, I think my own view is that I think we've been more unconscionably lax. So when we are talking about labor regulations, what is the range of things we are talking about, right? We are talking about the power to hire and fire.
Mm.
That frankly has been a pretty redundant clause for a very long time. I mean, there's a lot of empirical work showing that, if you look at turnover of firms over 100 people, it hasn't affected. States like Tamil Nadu and Haryana did Chinese level numbers in manufacturing. Actually hasn't been an obstacle, right? But sure, I mean, you can get some flexibility there. Then you're looking at wage bargaining, collective wage bargaining, right? Right? But the most important and neglected area of labor laws, both in implementation, has actually just been the bread and butter quotidian issues of workers' health, safety, and so forth, right? Just go to a construction site, right? There's supposed to be norms about, safety, right? People are still painting with, their hands dipped in paint rather than a brush. There's no safety equipment, right? And those things have huge health and income costs, right? Labor morbidity in India is very, very high, right? Right? So when we are crafting labor regulation, and this is why all this suspension of labor laws and stuff is completely beside the point, is you could still have that should be the grand social bargain. Look, we will give employers a little bit of the flexibility they're wanting, right? Provided they show good faith effort, meet many of these other that are actually critically vital. Health, safety, right? Long run, that's those more vital because frankly, the wage stuff of market will be a function of how skilled people. I mean, there's relatively little at the level of the firm. The market conditions will matter a lot, right? So if you're setting up, I mean, do you want an SEZ with no environmental laws and no worker safety protections, right? I mean, that honestly doesn't make, it doesn't make any normative sense.
So I mean, I just to build on that, and this is not a question, but initially most of the field work, and I mean, of course, we're recording, but I can mention this about our own university and the kind of how private universities mediate through these arrangements as well. Most of our work in the field, actually in the villages close by, they start from our discussions with workers on campus. Yeah. So the gardeners who are coming on campus, and so one of the questions I have been trying to ask different strata of workers is the reason of why they would prefer working in a university campus. Okay. Yeah. So imagine a person who's selling, who's working in Subway or in a few food outlets, even though Subway is a franchise, but a lot of them the preference, for example, and this is for a lot of male respondents in a small kind of short anecdotal conversations that I was having, was saying that, listen, we prefer working in the university campus because we get a higher number of paid leaves in a year because the campus is shut for a period of time. So, and the question I would often ask them is, so imagine if there were two Jindal or two Ashoka universities set up within a radius of, a few square kilometers, does it mean that more people are going to be encouraged to work there, whether in the food outlets? So of course, yes, because there's flexible working hours. You get paid for what you're doing. There is a constant need for demand, there's energy. The velocity of purchasing of consumptions are higher. But interestingly, a lot of women that I started asking, a lot of the gardeners on campus are predominantly all women. The campus recently started a creche facility for a lot of workers. And this was after a lot of faculty members started, making an effort that you don't need to have creche facilities for only faculty members or staff, but also other workers who are spending time on campus. This is the contractual. So interestingly, a lot of women who were walking to, and this is about the point that you made, that the small indignities that people are willing to probably kind of forego, said that we find working at a lower wage and walking to the campus, no matter how hot it is, because of the fact that for those hours in the day, we can put our children in this creche facility, which is provided, and that allows us a certain sense of agency to have an independent situation. And the bargaining power here is also the bargaining power they have at an intra-household level, within their own family. So how do you think in this situation, this is connected to Samarth's question, is what do you think can local, civil society or political parties do to be able to make this welfare dignity, compact a bit more of a, policy framework, or make it more part of the policy framework in considerations around labor rights?
So, look, I mean, that's a very nuanced question in the examples you gave. Although I won't congratulate any of our institutions too much. I mean, I think all of us have a very, very long way to go in trying to figure these things out. But I think illustratively, it does suggest, I think, three things which are, I think, important to keep. See, one, let's be so here. If one is just acting like putting on an economics thinking hat for a minute, right? A lot of how much of this happens will depend on the nature of the institution and their carrying power. So just take in this crisis, you have examples at the both end of the spectrum, right? You have examples where relatively prosperous firms completely abandon their workers. But you also have examples where actually the firms themselves were in as much distress after a couple of weeks, right? So one of the challenges of this is that, what my worry about, I mean, I think individual institutions should do it, right? Every institution should do whatever is within its power to do. I completely endorse that. But I actually think that the downside of that in a larger political sense is that essentially your own resources and your carrying capacity becomes a signal of virtue rather than it being right. We might be lucky enough to work in institutions that are somewhat industries, that are somewhat immune to recessions, right? People still want to be educated, willing to pay, right? And so what is actually going on here? I mean, is it simply that we can actually sustain this stuff, or is this actually a paradigm shift, right? So which is why, while at the level of individual institutions, we need to do all the things that you are actually talking about, right? And with much greater vigor. As an economist, right, that these things are not going to happen unless there are serious incentives in place for doing so. Now, the trick is, and I think this is where I think the real challenge at a society-wide level comes, is most employers think that doing these things or the state mandating these things be done will raise their costs, right? And sometimes the state wants to do it, wants to basically shift the cost to employers,
Yeah.
right? So one question to ask is which of these costs should be borne by the state, which of these costs should be borne by private employers? And your point about childhood care is important. I mean, I think it's a win-win. We know, for example, that for both health and education outcomes, preschool interventions are absolutely necessary. The education system is still not being able to equalize the disadvantage that sets in at the preschool level, right? So is it that the state looking at building creches or subsidizing them or something? If we see it only as an expenditure, we'll never get the argument going, right? But if you see it as potentially, right, an investment with return because it is reducing your costs of equalizing education later on, it could potentially be a win-win, right? So while civil society and individual firms need to do what they do, I think they have to be, in a sense, a little bit creative about what kinds of investments that are required. The second thing which is important, and this is something we haven't mentioned yet, is that, of course, India's big challenge is female labor force participation,
Yeah.
right? which is amongst the lowest in the world, and a variety of reasons and causes, right? But as you know, there is a kind of older literature in both the theory of the firm and in labor relations. How much of the labor relations that we have are actually about enhancing efficiency, or how much are they about simply disciplining and exercising power?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the one thing this COVID crisis has taught us, right, is you can be actually a lot more flexible and achieve, similar levels of productivity. In fact, rigidity in markets and and productivity have very little to do with each other, right? And that's an area where I think we do need to, in a sense, be creative, right? Allocation of shifts for women, if that is an issue, right? For example. And but the basic shift we need to make is we have to move from seeing them as expenditures to seeing them as investments, right? Then your cognitive fame and your commitment to doing it actually shifts considerably.
No, you're right. You're right. Actually, I tend to partially give that set of information. This whole idea around having the crash took, from what I remember, around 2.5 years of movements at different levels, students, faculty, staff, to have it on campus. And I think that was interesting, because for me, understanding to what extent the cognitive structure of priorities within institutions changes as a result of their own stakeholders trying to give a lot of weightage towards certain essential facilities are instrumental. And I think it was only possible because there's a higher presence of women in our campus. And that is to say, so this was really raised up as not an issue which like a few people were asking for. But so I think somewhere this idea of recognition, representation, which is often going into the discussion around affirmative action also, it seems to me that given the circumstances and the direction in which we are headed, welfare, whether it's food security, health security, and the security around, let's say to a certain extent, insurance-based systems, that is unemployment. Like if you're losing out a job, you will make sure that you will get paid for a certain number of days, is something which will gain greater precedence as we keep moving forward as a major policy question. The only reason why I feel a little more optimistic now is maybe because of this current crisis, because I never imagined so many people talking about worker-centric issues. Maybe this is a temporal phase, and maybe let's say 1 year down the line things may go back to the same scenario. But how do you see India's own position? When I say India, largely I'm talking about this cognitive prioritization from a union centric perspective, because a lot of things right now I'm seeing is, if it's a question of Atmanirbharta, it has to come from the top. And now Atmanirbharta, so everybody starts talking about, self-reliance is an idea. Farmers know it better than anyone else, how you to be Atmanirbhar. So how do you see this as a point coming in? Because I have a final 2C questions, but just to get your response on this, and then we'll conclude.
So I think three quick things in there, right? So one, I think, look, in the short to medium run, frankly, it's going to be a little tough, mainly because let's not pretend this stuff will require resources.
Yeah.
Right? And we are in a serious fiscal jam, right? So unless there is serious political pressure from the below, right? This is probably going to be a little bit on the back burner. I mean, that's my worry about public health, for example, that I don't think you're going to see that ramping up. So, for example, on food, there's a political consensus, right, that if you don't distribute rations at least, so we've extended that scheme till November, right? Right, something like that, right? But it took a little bit of political pressure to get there, right? So I actually do think we are in a little bit for the long haul on this one, which is that given the mistakes we made coming into the pandemic, we first need to, in a sense, sort them out to create a little bit of space for this. Right? Yeah. I think the second thing that is going to happen is, and this I'll be candid about, which is, growth does matter to bargaining positions, right? Which is to say that, the demand for labor, as I said, is the best bargaining tool that labor has, right? And in the short run, yes, because of a kind of demand crunch, some labor have gone home, your people aren't sure who's coming. There's a lot of discourse around this, right? But on the other hand, if growth remains relatively low, right? I think all those sort of cost-cutting arguments and stuff will actually, in some senses, kind of, I think, take precedence of this, right? So I do think, as you're right, that as a moment of raising consciousness, this has been an extraordinary moment in some ways. We can't sort of make people invisible in the way in which we had, right? But that is still running up into a larger structural wall, right? Of the underlying sort of economic rigidities and fiscal constraints. And that's why I think it's politically a dangerous moment. It's politically a dangerous moment because it's precisely this gap that can actually lead to greater social conflict and social dysfunction in some ways, right? And which is why we need to sort of pull out all stops and make this top priority.
Oh, that's. I mean, so I just wrote a column, and it's likely to probably come out in Mint, and they'd asked me to look at this recent announcement that the Prime Minister made. And the interesting thing that you point out is this amalgamation of the old and new versions of the welfare state. The old being that you had a government coming into power critiquing the public distribution system, Manrega. Prime Minister was very critical of the initial scenarios, but these have become now the principal tools for distribution of those basic resources, right? And the government seems to have realized that Jan Dhan Yojana and the Trinity and all of those things, in terms of the state's ability to safeguard those through those channels, is less utilized as compared to the other ones, which have been around for a longer time. Of course, it's an emergency scenario. But the new version of this state, of the welfare state, seems to be that we will do this at a time where politically it is going to reap us the highest set of dividends. So I'm imagining if this was an election year, you would have not seen this lag in announcement coming in. I mean, I consciously saw the Prime Minister mentioning Chhath Puja somewhere in his announcement, which is the first time I heard him mentioning after Diwali that to announce the increase in delegation. So are we seeing an establishment in the politics of the state today, decisions made more on political principles, less on commercial logic or fiscal challenges? Or alternatively, is it something that one tends to read too much into it, and it's just something that you have those old tools, but there is nothing that you're seeing which is very new. It's still the old that we used to see before?
No, so, two things. So one, look, I mean, in a democracy, policymakers do respond to politics. And frankly, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, that's why democracy works. If people are getting upset and PDS is not being distributed, it's a reasonable thing to, respond to it. And that's, by the way, always been the case. I mean, it's right. I think the issue there, right, and this is, I think, where I think the big challenge is that, when we go to, let's say, the pre-2009 crisis phase, right? Let's say 2002 to 2009, 2010, when India was growing at 7-8%, right? Right. One of the interesting things about that moment was that there was a sense that, and why there was optimism, right? That, look, your underlying savings rates is going up. You have about 35% savings rate, should get you enough for a kind of investment, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You had a relatively benign external environment in terms of exports, right? You grew at about 7 to 8%. And that is going to be able to generate additional resources to be able to do two things. One, create a new architecture of the welfare state, right? And we forget that this architecture is actually not, I mean, PDS is very old, but Narega is a product of that time, right? And we used to then argue that Narega is also very expensive and all, right? Okay. And the second is that it allows you to spend on things that make you competitive.
Yeah.
Right? Infrastructure and stuff. So, even under those policy paralysis days, India built more infrastructure than it had in the previous 15, 20 years, right? Now, that system got stuck in two crises. One was a banking fiscal credit crisis, right? And that was in part related to corruption, not entirely, but in part related to corruption, right? And the fact of the matter is that we have still not fully come out of that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the NPA story, the health of the banking system is still, in a sense, a very, very big question mark, right? Right? Whether we can, how do we finance our own development in some senses, right? And the one thing that slow growth did over the last 5 to 6 years, relatively slow growth did, is that it cuts down your fiscal space in creating a new social contract, right? So, in principle, I don't think there is deep opposition to creating a new social contract, enhancing the welfare state in different ways. And most politicians would love that. I mean, right? The issue is, how do you break this log jam that has kind of trapped you in that moderate growth cycle? Because until that is broken, right? I mean, you know from government revenue growth, that period, you would expect revenue bounce of about 18 to 20% a year if you had 7% growth rates, right? Right. By the way, it's hit defense expenditure. I mean, look at this government ideologically. One of the governments that came in most ideologically committed to a robust defense sector. In real terms, India's defense spending has been falling, right? So you don't break out of that growth rate. All the other things, I think, are a function of that.
Yeah. No, I think I totally agree, sir. That is something which is without the priority. I mean, growth buys you that bargaining power that you need, but more importantly, the kind of social policy or public policy changes that you require to sustain that process of change that we're talking about requires a greater economic reliance on, I think, growth in different compositions. Because I think so far in the last 6 years, what we have seen is it's just the government as a sector working. The private sector has kind of given up a little bit because it just finds itself caught up in this, the logjam that you're talking about. They're caught up in this logjam that, well, we're facing a problem from the banks in being able to get what we required, or alternatively, we're facing a concern that there is weak demand in the industry that we're working. In fact, the only sectors which were doing well were FMCG, media and entertainment, and all of those now have been hit because of the pandemic. So, I mean, that point is well taken. The final two questions, and this is one of this question is coming a few times, so I just do want to get your views on it. This is a student, I think, working on Sino-Indian relations, and it's taking us a little bit out of this local micro scenario. But so I'll probably ask this now. It is well known that India was offered a permanent membership to the UN Security Council twice in the 1950s, and was denied then. Again, we have the mention of Prime Minister Nehru. There are criticism as well as defense for the move, but what is your view about the same? I mean, the student is actually looking at the history of Sino-Indian relations. So your views on this would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, look, so, I mean, that particular episode, right, and the circumstances under which the Security Council offer was made, how serious it was. I mean, these kind of declassified papers where, Dulles and others discuss it. Frankly, you need, a historian like Srinath Raghavan to decode the details, because, two things about writing history, which as a non-historian and or at least being educated by my historian friends, I think are very true, is that one, we do write with a lot of 2020 hindsight, right? And number two, the contextualization of particular negotiations and offers, right? I mean, I once, just for the fun of it, was sort of, reading a lot of declassified KGB documents, as you know, the Mitrokhin archive, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And frankly, I mean, there was a lot of stuff in there. You could in a sense kind of ask the question, why this, why that, right? But if you put it in context, right? And by the way, this is true of, for example, WikiLeaks as well, right? Which is, there is a lot of stuff said, right? And the fact that a lot of stuff is said, for example, there was this recent thing in Narayani Basa's biography. Nehru did not want Patel in the cabinet, right? Completely disproved by a whole range of other evidence, right? So at these very highest levels, right, I think one has to be a little bit cautious in interpreting this evidence, and this is not my domain, so I'm agnostic on it. Willing to be persuaded. I won't take a. But this larger question, right, about India's foreign policy and how we think of the, in some senses, the Nehruvian years. God knows, India made a lot of mistakes. By the way, every power has made mistakes. I mean, I mean, one of the extraordinary things that studying international relations teaches you, right, is every single power, right, not only makes mistakes, sometimes well-intentioned mistakes, right? But sometimes it's hard to predict what kind of mistake will prove to be costly. Right? The United States had all this thing, we can absorb, the costs of failure, right? I mean, ultimately, Iraq and Afghanistan both did them in ways in which nobody could have anticipated, right? So, and this is one quarrel I do have with international relations. I think there's this kind of, realism often presents itself as a kind of omniscient thing as well, right? I know the structure of the world. Realist power requires doing X, Y, and Z, right? So I do think we made mistakes. There's no question about it. There is an interesting question: when did we misread Chinese intentions? Right? Was it a foregone conclusion in 1957? Was it a foregone conclusion in 1948? But let me make a reverse, just to provoke you. I mean, this is just as a thinking experiment, right? Which is, we do know that both India and China are complex civilizational states trying to convert themselves into nation states, right? And being nation states meaning, you have to have borders. Borders were demarcated, not demarcated again by colonial powers, right? So here's a tricky question for us. In the 1950s, right, what would have been a reasonable compromise to have actually made, right? Remember, what is the Chinese narrative? The Chinese narrative is, we put the trading of the eastern sectors and the western sectors on the table, right? And the fact of the matter is, no power is going to negotiate with us because we know that because of our domestic politics, absolutely no agreement and progress is possible. I mean, we couldn't even resolve Sar Creek with Pakistan, right? So you can actually turn the argument on its head and say, yes, right? Nehru made a lot of mistakes. We underestimated, particularly on the hard power side, right? That as a country, you do need a minimum set of investments where you can actually protect your border, right? But you also need a domestic politics that allows clarity on what, in a sense,
Yeah,
its strategic objective is,
totally.
right? Uh, uh, to be controversial to say this out, if India's domestic politics had allowed the Musharraf-Manmohan agreement to take place, we would be in a very different position. It's the only sensible framework, right? And again, it's a matter of timing, right? You just have to, get that little window in international relations, right? So yes, I mean, there's no question, I think, but I would not be so confident that it's easy to be. I mean, I'll be very honest with you. I have absolutely no idea what's happening in China. I mean, what the Chinese are doing is compatible with 5 different hypotheses, right? You can say these are military geniuses who are using the pandemic to gain strategic advantage, right? But to me, it also looks like a state completely in disarray, flailing, right, and overreaching in ways in which are going to have deleterious consequences for China in the short run.
Yeah.
So we have to hold our nerve a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And not go from incident to incident, as opposed to thinking of the larger framework.
I mean, the term that comes to my mind, we'll close in 10 minutes, but I think just this point of, it's a term that often is used in the financial markets context when you have series of financial crises that come, by Professor Robert Shiller, who won a Nobel in economics. The term which is used is irrational exuberance. And I just feel somehow what China seems to be doing in terms of its, I don't know, strategic overreach in almost all set and corners and the kind of conflicts it's ensuing is a reflection of some kind of, it has no clear rational seem in sight, even though that is the case, but it also seems very upbeat and exuberant about doing this and in a very voracious diplomatic, the term which was being used as wolf warrior diplomacy as a way of a very different kind of Chinese way of looking at it. So I think maybe that's a way of how one tends to look at what is happening, whether it's, whether it has a strategic objective in mind, whether it's a result of a domestic scenario, what is happening within China and the anger and angst against President Xi or whatever that might be. But it seems from the outside, at least when you're looking what is happening within the South China Sea dispute with India, in its own diplomatic relationships with Australia, even Canada for that matter. I was following through a friend that there were 2 planes sent at the time of the first week of the lockdown from Canada to China. And this was in search for masks and orders for which payments have been made. And both planes returned empty-handed because there was no arrangements made by the Chinese, even though the Prime Minister of Canada and the President here in China had made that arrangement. And that created this very cold, partnership there. Just the final question, and this is a question which is mostly for students who are interested in studying political science, political philosophy, because these are courses that students are doing across schools. And this takes me a little bit to a question I had put out earlier, and I did ask that time because I wanted to close our discussion with this. So if you don't mind, may I just read something? In 2019, you wrote a column which was more of a critical reflection of Weber's 2 famous essays, Politics as a Vocation and Science as a Vocation. And you say, I quote, what does it mean to invest in a vocation with meaning in an age characterized by disenchantment and rationalization? What does it mean to take quote unquote politics or quote unquote science both as a profession and as something deeper calling? What ethical commitments and character traits do they draw upon? I know this is it's a kind of an overreach, but if there's a student right now who's coming into the academic field and is trying to learn, make sense of what's happening around, a lot of our students are back home and right now they're facing this, pandemic, and they have their own, emotions there in place. What is that you would say to them in terms of course, how to, read and get aware about the nature of questions that are most profound about the current space? But one principal question that if you could respond is, and this is a question that Weber asked, is what makes political action as exemplar that is credible in the eyes of others? That's a question that Weber asked that essay, and that would probably end.
Okay, wow. I mean, this is a big question. So, I mean, I think, look, Weber's essays were remarkable because they're both written in products of crisis. And they're actually an answer to a question like just the one you were asking, right? I mean, these are students at Munich University saying, her professor, the world is falling apart. Germany has just lost a war. There's the possibility of a, Bolshevik revolution. There are all kinds of groups. What do we do, right? I mean, so I'm going to quickly maybe make very briefly 3 or 4 points. A couple of are unfashionable, but I think it's worth saying. So the first and most important thing, which I do personally believe in, and I think it's important to maintain at this point, is there is a distinction between academia and politics. In fact, Weber would be absolutely aghast at the thought of academics becoming politicians, or vice versa, right? Each vocation has its own integrity and a basic set of questions and privileges that come with it, right? So yes, I mean, I know we are all sophisticated enough theorists that, all academia has a political dimension, has political implications and all of that stuff. But fundamentally, we have the luxury to, in a sense, think about the conditionality of everything. Why is this happening? Under what conditions is this happening? Right? And a lot of Weber's ire was directed against what he called academic prophets, academic crusaders, right? Who could not, in a sense, maintain that, let's say, their own professional integrity. And I actually think in this moment of crisis, it's even more important to actually maintain that credibility, right? Nothing is done, the cause of liberal education, the cause of centrist politics, more harm than the fact that it's easy to say academics are just politicians in disguise. I mean, that's the death knell of us, right? So that's one proposition, right? And we should think of it as a privilege, right? I mean, who else gets a luxury to ask these questions about the conditionality of why something? I think the second thing about politics, and this was one of the things that Weber wanted to talk about, is that he wanted to give a very disillusioning account of politics, right? You had all these young students who went into politics because of idealism, right? And idealism means you want to shape the world according to your ideas, right? And here is Weber beginning by saying, actually, most of politics is not like that. Politics is about party building, it's about machines, it's about partisanship, it's about organization, right? The real nuts and bolts of politics, which frankly are like the nuts and bolts of everything else, right? It's a lot of hard, boring, grunge work. And Weber, one thing he wanted to tell his students was that if you're going into politics and you don't have a stomach for that stuff, don't go into politics. It's not for you, right? And I have to say, I mean, it's controversial to say, but Mr. Amit Shah might be thinking of his ideological agenda. But one thing he's also good at is thinking that stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And Weber was saying, look, it is in the nature of modern politics that unless you can think powerfully about this stuff as well, right? Politics is not a field of dreams. Politics is also this nitty-gritty of building organizing, which is why it's so hard for people to be good at it. The third thing he wanted to say, which is I think even more acute in times like ours, right? As you very famously know, right? He made a distinction between the politics of conviction and the politics of responsibility, right? And the politics of conviction begins with a very simple proposition that I have convictions. My integrity demands that I make the world conform to my convictions, right? I'm a pacifist, pacifism all the way down, right? Now, Weber's great insight was to say that's a very anti-political way of thinking about politics. Because the cardinal fact about politics is there are other agents as well, right? And not only are there other agents, there are agents who think differently from you, number one. Number two, the cardinal fact about politics is because there are other agents, you cannot easily predict the consequences of your good intentioned action. So the example he gave, very pertinent to these times, he says, look, there are all these pacifists who want to leak government secrets to embarrass government. Now, their intention is fine, even their principle may be fine. But the consequence might be that it might make war more likely, right? Now, who's going to take responsibility for that, right? Now, in an era like ours, right, where all the settled constitutional norms are up for a toss, right, where frankly, there's very little political opposition. I mean, we don't know what parameters to follow, right? These questions become even more urgent and important, right? You might say this is a benefit for your generation, maybe this is a burden for your generation, but there are no settled pathways left anymore.
Yeah.
And what Weber wanted to say is that, look, you have to have the stomach for these kinds of things. Bring the passion, right? I mean, one of the challenges with politics is that you go into it, and by the time you're done this organization, you've forgotten why you came to politics in the first place, right? Yeah. So the ideal politician wants to combine this ethic of responsibility with ethic of conviction in some ways. But the most important role of a politician, and why I still, why do we believe in democracy? I don't want government run by academics and bureaucrats. We'd be the worst group to run any society. Because the fundamental role of a politician is the role of social mediation, right? His role is not to begin by saying, I have the best theory, how do I implement it? That's how academics think, right?
Absolutely.
Other things being equal, what's the best thing to do, right? A politician's role is to say, look, you have a viewpoint, I have a viewpoint, there are 15 other constituencies with a viewpoint, and there are different competing interests. And a successful society is one that can mediate the conversation between them. By the way, it's true of economics as well. I mean,
yes,
Germany is a successful society because politicians mediate that conversation and bargain, right? What are the skills necessary to cultivating that sensibility, right? That's not an academic skill. That sometimes requires listening. It requires this incredible judgment about when to listen and when to inject your own argument, right? And people still trust politicians because they think politicians, whatever else their other faults, right? They do think of themselves as social mediators. They don't think of themselves as people with ex ante answers which they need to give to anybody. Politicians need to be chameleon-like, to be very frank, right? Not chameleon-like as in it's a betrayal of integrity, but it's, look, if the public is pushing me, I need to listen to them seriously, right? Now, we are in a very peculiar situation, that's the thought I like with, where most people have given up on politics in a conventional sense. And the only form of politics that is left is a politics that is built around nationalist conviction. Simple political agenda, which is, I can create broader and broader coalitions by constantly generating enemies of the people. Right? Now, it can be very successful in the short run, but it's not going to be the politics that does the job of minimizing conflict and effective social mediation.
Well, it's been a truly enlightening 2 hours, and I would say my apologies for bombarding you with questions from almost all alters and radars that we could. But sir, it's been a pleasure and honor, and at the same time, I think a lot for us to think and grasp about. I think particularly a few of your I think responses to certain questions has definitely made me thinking on the way we are trying to now directionally look at identifying certain projects in the future. I am to a certain extent hopeful of the kind of change that is happening at the very grassroots level with a new, fresh vibe of energy. I would be the first one to say that the 32 students who are working within the center, all of them independently right now in this last 3 months have been involved in community development work in some way or the other. And I've been just fascinated to know about the kind of intention, which is rare. I didn't see this when I started teaching like around 7-8 years back in Pune, that there was this strong disconnect between what needs to be done at a certain level and what your own responsibilities are. But having said that, I think as scholars who are trying to look at from a position of privilege, but also a position of distance, whatever is happening right now, I would urge everyone to keep going back to this session as a way of trying to come up with responses and look at questions of theorizing what is left undone in social sciences. Thank you so much, sir. With that, we will end. Thank you.
Thank you all for being so patient. It's heroic to spend 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yeah. Thank you so much.